Microsoft dropped earnings today, and for Xbox, it's getting really interesting. It is that time of the quarter and one of 4 days out of the year where Microsoft basically lays out the books and says, here's what's going on. Now, they don't always give us all the details that we want, like specific Game Pass subscriber numbers, but they generally lay out how the company is doing and whether or not they're healthy or if they're facing some headwinds, which the industry is seeing across the board. So, as we always do, we're going to focus in on the Xbox numbers, but first, at a super high level, at the org level, Microsoft reported $50 billion in revenue. So that just means how much money they brought in the quarter, which is an increase of 11%. Now, net income, which is the amount of money that Microsoft gets to shovel into its bank account after it pays all of its expenses, was $17.6 billion, which is actually a decline of 14%. But overall, again, a very healthy quarter from Microsoft. Yes, it could always be better. They would love to see that revenue or the net income increase even more. But as we all know what's going on in the world, things are a little bit dicey. But let's dive into some of the gaming figures. And I'll throw up some slides on here and other information as we dive through this because there's kind of a lot to digest. So overall for gaming, Microsoft said that gaming revenue increased slightly at about 4%. But Xbox content and services revenue, which is what Microsoft says, hey, judge us by our content and service revenue, actually decreased 3%. Now, on the surface, that's not great because like judge us by this and the thing we're supposed to judge them by actually declined. But if you look at constant currency, which is a fancy way of sort of leveling the playing field, if you adjust for Forex, foreign exchange and all that kind of stuff, it says actually things increased for content and services by about 1%. What does it really mean in like plain explain like I'm five language? It really just means that it was flat, meaning that last year at the same time and this year, they did roughly the same amount of revenue. Didn't grow, didn't really shrink. It's just kind of saying that it was flat. But there is a very, very interesting line in these slides, which you can see here over on the right where they talk about the 3% decline. There is some really interesting language. They say that the decline was partially offset by the growth in Xbox Game Pass subscribers. That is sort of the first time we've really seen Microsoft come out and say, like, look, we were declining, but Game Pass really started to boost us up. Now, Microsoft, unfortunately, did not actually share how many Game Pass subscribers they have during this event. So the last number we know of is about 25 million, way earlier back in the beginning of this year. Unfortunately, they still need to rev that number. But during their earnings call, Satya Nadella, the CEO, did say that PC Game Pass subscriptions increased 159% year over year. So, just logically speaking, it looks like maybe PC Game Pass really bumped up some of those numbers for the quarter based on that information alone. And they also said that 20 million people have used cloud gaming to stream games to date. Now, that is up 10 million users, effectively doubled what they announced previously. Previously, they said 10 million people had done this. Now what happened between the 10 and the 20 million number? Microsoft, remember, brought Fortnite to Xbox Game Pass, or the cloud streaming, if you will, whatever you want to call it these days. They brought Fortnite, and so they saw 10 million more people. Now, it's not probably 10 million exactly Fortnite, but let's be honest, Fortnite has a massive following. It certainly started to pay some dividends. Now, other super interesting numbers here. Xbox hardware revenue grew 13%. Now remember, this is year over year, so this is actually comparing to a previous quarter where the Xbox Series S and X were on sale. So from a hardware perspective, Microsoft actually sold quite a few. Now, let's be fair to the industry. Is this because they had more units to sell? Does this mean that the supply chains are really easing up? I think it is part of that. I don't think you can discredit and say like, look, they didn't have as many consoles on the shelves last year, so obviously they didn't sell as many, and this year they have more, so they're going to sell more. That's a pretty fair and logical argument, but either way, from Microsoft's perspective, they sold 13% more Xbox hardware than they did a year ago, which is a very positive sign because that's 13% more than they can try to sell Game Pass to. So that is important to keep that in mind. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that these numbers that Microsoft is showing off here, you can see across the board in their more personal computing, which is where the Xbox division sits. This is on the tail end of the pandemic. Now, I'm not saying the pandemic is over. I'm definitely not saying that. People are still getting sick or whatever. But from a vendor perspective, Microsoft is no longer selling PCs like they were. That is absolutely not happening. And so that party has officially come and gone, and more people are just interacting in society again. So there's less people likely playing games. And also keep in mind that this is July, August, and September timeframe for Microsoft. So this is the previous quarter that we just went through. Now, those are not the only numbers that are worth discussing today, because there's more information that has come out. Now, granted, this information is not directly from Microsoft, but it is absolutely worth discussing because there's some fine details in here that sort of marry up nicely to what Microsoft has announced today. So VGC Charts, VGC Charts with a Z on it, released some information today. Now, granted, again, PlayStation does reveal actual consoles sold, and so the Xbox side are definitely estimates, but there is some fascinating information here because, as I said, prior to even these consoles launching, if Microsoft could close the gap between a 2-to-1 ratio, which is what we all believe, and actually that might even been worse than that based on some later information from the court documents that Microsoft trying to acquire Activision. Based on that information, we know that for every one Xbox that was sold, 2 PlayStations were sold. So trying to close that gap is a very big deal. And you can see from their information here that Microsoft is actually closing the gap here on PlayStation. In 2021, which you can see at the top right quadrant, if you will, the difference between PlayStation consoles sold and the estimated Xbox Series S and X consoles sold was about 4 million. Now, in 2022, that gap year to date has closed to about a little over 1 million. We'll say 1.2 million. That is massively closing that gap. They are very close within striking distance, if they have a good holiday season or something like that, to actually being about on par with PlayStation. This is a very, very big deal for Microsoft because, again, they're trying to catch up to Sony. That is sort of it's a chase at this point. And obviously Sony's going to remain ahead, and I actually fully expect Sony to outsell the Series X and X through the S and X throughout the life cycle of this generation of consoles, but that doesn't mean that it can't be a success for Microsoft. Sony so far has sold about 16.3 million units based on this data from 2021 and 2022. And Xbox, based on these estimates, have sold about 11 million units, a little more than 11 million, which means 27 million next-gen consoles have been sold. If you do the math, which I know you know that I did, it means that Microsoft is, for every one Xbox console that is sold based on this information to date, only 1.5 PlayStation consoles are being sold. That is a huge closing of the gap for Microsoft. That is a very big deal, and it shows that Microsoft is making good traction and momentum with their offering. Now, is it purely the hardware perspective? Is it Game Pass? It's probably a marriage of all of those components. But the point here is that based on the data that we have, Microsoft selling 13% more consoles this year. We were going to be curious to see what they do for hardware for the holidays. Remember, Sony just increased the price of the PlayStation 5 abroad, primarily driven by Forex, which foreign exchange currency, which is a very notable, and I understand why they did that. Microsoft noted on some of their earnings today that, hey, those headwinds, they call them Forex headwinds, don't always play in favor of what Microsoft and Team Xbox are doing. All that being said, Microsoft is putting itself into a position where it can really truly capitalize on what's going on. They're showing that there is growth in cloud gaming, despite the fact that their court documents in the Brazil this one came out of the UK acquisition said, look, cloud gaming isn't really all that popular. Microsoft just now comes out and says at least 20 million people have tried it. They didn't say how many people are using it every month or every week or every day by any stretch, but either way, Microsoft is really lining it up with a multi-aligned strategy to start to really penetrate into the gaming market. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the pivotal holiday shopping season. I think this is going to be a defining quarter for Xbox and PlayStation because while it's not perfect, I believe that this quarter will probably be one of the first quarters where supply constraints on both the PlayStation side and the Xbox side shouldn't be too much of a factor. Yes, there's still going to be shortages across the board, especially if they run big deals or whatever, but we've all seen, or at least I have seen in my research, that PlayStations are now easily more available in retail environments. And they're not perfect. You still might see them sold out. Same on the Xbox side. The Series S has been available pretty handedly, for a while now. And the Series X has finally caught up. So it's much easier now to walk into a Best Buy or a Target and get the console of your choosing, which means this holiday season, we should see a better one-to-one, at least shopping experience, and get a better understanding of how these consoles are going to sell into the next year. So it'll be interesting to see. Microsoft's going to start putting its strategy out here soon. I think we'll start seeing potentially bundles. Will we see better deals? Or they might just stay the course knowing that PlayStation had to raise the pricing and potentially have a better offering with Game Pass. And so we will see what happens here. Either way, I think this has been a really, really interesting quarter. Xbox, again, is in a healthy position, even though they are pretty much flat. Given that we think we're probably heading into an R word, which I'm not going to say, overall, I think Xbox appears to be in a healthy place. And as always, if you want to stay updated on everything else that is happening in the world of Microsoft, Xbox, and beyond, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.